On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. You know that sentence. That's the way that most American documentaries on World War II seem to begin. The one thing that seems to be missing in whatever happened on December 6, what is it that went through the mind of the Japanese that they wanted to attack the Americans in the first place? And also, how come the Japanese had such a large fleet of aircraft carriers when most East Asian powers at that time had no way near that kind of power at their disposal? In other words, what made Japan so powerful and also so aggressive? Well, that's the question we will try to answer today as we explore the history of Japan all the way from the late Tokugawa era through the Meiji period, World War I, and then through glory and infamy and defeat in World War II. Stay tuned. In a previous video on Tokugawa Japan, we explored the history of that country from 1603, when the Tokugawa shoguns came to office, up until 1867, when they were gently pushed out the door. Just as a quick recap, the big story back then was how to handle relationships between Japan and the outside world. And the shoguns that would have ruled Japan at that time, the Tokugawas, passed what would be known as the Exclusion Edict, aka the Closed Country Edict, where they would prevent foreign missionaries from operating on Japanese soil. This way you don't have pesky Catholic missionaries telling the Japanese that the emperor is not truly a god. And you also prevented foreign merchants from operating on Japanese soil. This way they don't sell weapons or anything that might upset the internal order. And based on those closed country edicts and other measures, the Tokugawas were able to remain in power for about 250 years, quite successfully so, but at the expense of almost freezing their country in time and completely missing out on things like the Industrial Revolution. So that by the 1850s and 1860s, Japan is still very much stuck in the feudal order of the medieval era, where you have samurai fighting on horseback, bows, arrows, swords, castles, at a time when in Europe or in the United States, you have railroads and steamships and gunboats. And you can see a big gap that has developed. The issue for Japan was that in 1853, an American fleet led by Commodore Perry showed up in Japan and demanded for the right to trade. The shoguns did not want that to happen, but they could not fight back because by that point the United States has big, powerful gunboats, and Japan did not. So that was a major humiliation for Japan that had to open itself, kicking and screaming to the outside world. The best they could do was to ask one of their ladies, the geisha Okichi, to seduce the U.S. consul Townsend Harris as a way to kind of encourage him to negotiate a better treaty for Japan. A rather humiliating story of American penetration of Japan. So that's the story where we had gotten to in the previous lecture on the topic. So what happens next? Is Japan going to be subjected to more and more unequal treaties? And ultimately maybe carved out and colonized, which is kind of the norm in the 19th century throughout Asia? Or will they find a way to develop pretty quickly in order to stand up to foreign aggression? Well, the person who answered that question was a young man called Mutsuhito, who was from the Imperial line of Japan. And when he became emperor, he took on the imperial name of Meiji, M-E-I-J-I. In fact, the whole name of the period is known after him. It's the Meiji Era of Japan because he was so influential. Traditionally, the emperors of Japan had played a very limited role in politics. They were more symbols of the country and figureheads rather than actual ruler. But the Emperor Meiji decided, I'm going to actually take control of Japan. I'm going to be in the capital, Tokyo, and I'll push out the Tokugawa shoguns, and from now on, I am in charge. So what did that mean, being in charge? Aside from pushing out the Tokugawas, it also meant getting rid of the samurai class. Thank you for the service, but I don't think that men fighting with swords and bows and arrows is a good thing for the late 19th century. What he told the samurai was maybe you could transform yourself into a businessman. That's how you could serve your country, modernize the country as businessmen. And some of them kind of followed along and accepted that transition. Others could not. And they were kind of torn between two competing emotions. One was a devotion to tradition, which is very big in the Bushido, the code of honor of the samurai, and they didn't want to leave aside their old ways. but there's also a notion of loyalty to the emperor, which is very important. So you have a revolt against the Meiji Emperor at that time. If you're interested in that topic, I would strongly recommend watching a movie on the topic, The Last Samurai. Tom Cruise plays the role of an American advisor who shows up in Japan during the Meiji Era as a way to train the new army that the Meiji Emperor is putting together. And that would be an army based on Western values. You draft peasants, equip them with modern weapons like rifles and machine guns, and when the samurai revolt, then you try to defeat those samurai. As it happens, Tom Cruise gets captured by the samurai side, gets enamored with the samurai lifestyle. Of course, he falls in love with a girl. What happens in the end, whether Tom Cruise and the samurai prevail against the peasants armed with machine guns, you have to watch the movie to figure that out. But I can tell you the real life. The real story is that, well, the samurai were defeated. Somehow a machine gun is stronger than a sword, in case you didn't figure that out by yourself. So after really installing himself in power, the Meiji Emperor could decide which kind of policies he would embrace. Specifically, he wanted to modernize Japan as soon as possible. How do you do that? Well, one element would be to look towards the West for answers. Even though he was very angry at the United States and other countries for imposing unequal treaties on Japan, he figured my enemy is strong, so my policy will be to copy my enemy. So you would invite foreign advisors to Japan, whether it's Tom Cruise to train your army, or maybe German chemists, French lawyers, British steel experts, and at high cost you pay them to teach you how things are done. Also, you want to develop what is a hallmark of the industrial era. Steel mills, textile mills, shipyards, and the like. To do so, you would have two basic models that you could embrace. Either you could follow the capitalist model that was dominant at the time, Adam Smith and the like. In that case, the government does nothing, and you let the magic of free enterprise do its thing. Or you could embrace the communist model, which was coming into being at that point. It's after the publication of the works of Karl Marx, in which case the government would take over all the main assets of production and kind of lead the way into the future by having 5-year plans. Well, by and large, Japan stuck with the capitalist model with a little tweak that was slightly communist in that sense. It's mostly a capitalist environment, but to speed the process a bit, some key companies that were known as zaibatsu would be helped at key points by the government. So let's say you want a former samurai turned businessman to start a shipyard. Well, you tell them, here's some land that belongs to the government, we will lease it to you at no cost. And to actually build a shipyard, we will raise some funds and then give you a loan at a very interesting interest rates. And in case you're afraid of not finding enough customers, the Japanese Navy will buy the first 5 ships, and we'll have a kind of a sweetheart deal where the contract will guarantee you a profit down the line. And if you do all of that, the zaibatsu will be set up pretty quickly and then be able to transition to the civilian market and sell steel ships to civilians as well. And with that method, incorporating about 90% capitalism and 10% state intervention, you would have a rapid development where in a matter of 1 generation, Japan pretty much went from the Middle Ages to the industrial era. It's that dramatic in the late 19th century. And that's how Japan became, almost overnight, the most advanced industrial country in Asia, and the only country in that area that would have gone through industrial revolution. Sometimes you can tell a lot by visual aspects. Meiji, as an emperor, would have been put in the throne using the traditional garb of Japanese emperors. But if you look at that portrait, you'll notice that he also liked to be dressed in a more Western way, with a uniform, military uniform, that gives you a sense of how he saw power as a source of all the reforms, but a Western-style uniform. And you see that reflected also in the art from the Meiji Era in Japan, which is quite beautiful. Japan has a long tradition of watercolors and such, where you have motifs like Fujiyama that will pop up, or cherry blossoms, another symbol of Japan. Well, these continue in the Meiji Era, but they now incorporate more modern things. Some paintings might have people that are now dressed in Western-style Victorian dresses, as opposed to being dressed with traditional kimonos, and the man would be in a uniform like the emperor. And you might have a big bridge slicing through the painting, incorporating the modern and the traditional. Interestingly, and that's the beauty of world history, that exchange goes both ways. At the same time that Japan is borrowing things from the outside world, by virtue of being exchanging goods in the outside world, people in Europe or North America first get exposed to Japan and are fascinated by that. If you see that painting, for example, you might think it's a Japanese painting. Well, it's not. It's from a Dutch painter working in France, one of the great figures of the Impressionist movement. Vincent van Gogh was so enamored with Japanese art that he made some paintings in the Japanese style. That other illustration that you see here is of Émile Zola, one of the leading French writers of the time, a leading figure of the realist movement, also quite enamored with the Meiji Era. And you can see in the background that there's a room separator, which is a folded screen from East Asia. So the Meiji Era was a great success for Japan. The economy took off, the military got stronger, and diplomatically, the country was no longer bullied by outside powers. Japan is the one country in the neighborhood that people don't mess with anymore. Extraterritoriality privileges are rescinded, for example. So if the story stopped right here, it would be a story of a great success. So one country that kind of looked toward the West and took what was positive about it and successfully found the recipe to industrialize in a matter of one generation. Well, the story does not end there, unfortunately. Japan, after being the victim of foreign bullying, once it got stronger, decided that maybe I should attack my neighbors. Why did they do that? Well, in part because they could. They had an army that was far stronger than that of their neighbors, but also because of greed, desire to expand, to make money. If you look at the map of Japan, you'll notice that it's pretty small. It's an archipelago of 4 main islands, and most of them are mountainous. So there's only that much land for people to plant rice and the like. Most of the people today would be concentrated in one plain that goes from Tokyo to Hiroshima. It's one pretty much continuous city nowadays. So you quickly run out of space as your population booms. Where could you find space? Well, maybe you look to East Asia, where there's a lot of space, where your farmers could find some land. Also, as the industry of Japan took off, you needed some raw materials to feed all that machinery, coal and iron in particular, or oil and other products. As it happened, Japan is not very lucky in that it has very, very few natural resources of its own. So it had to import most of its coal and iron and the like. So if you look at places like North Korea, Manchuria, northern China, all these places are rich in coal and iron. It's very tempting to take over those places to get the land and the raw materials that you need. And that's what would lead Japan to expand in those areas. There's also an element of a sense of superiority. When the Japanese took over what essentially were colonies, they called that a co-prosperity sphere, meaning that both sides would benefit from being colonized by Japan, that they were doing good to the people being colonized. We've seen that argument being used by other Western powers, and usually it was mixed in with a sense of racial superiority, that you think you need to civilize others because they are barbaric and are in need of civilization, they are an inferior race. Well, the same thing would be true in Asia, where the Japanese, who are quite isolated from the rest of Asia, would think of themselves as a very distinct race, ethnically speaking, and far superior to the Koreans, the Chinese, and the Filipinos. And so they would have to show to others how things are done because they were the one country in the neighborhood that had successfully managed the transition to the industrial era. The main country that suffered from that Japanese expansion would be nearby China, which normally is the 800-pound gorilla in the neighborhood, but by the late 19th, early 20th century would be in the death throes of the Qing dynasty and kind of easy prey for foreign domination. You have one war in 1894-95 between Japan and China, which Japan won, and as a result was able to take over Korea, which used to be a vassal state of China, and push it into the orbit of Japan, and eventually was annexed altogether by Japan. Taiwan and other islands settled mostly by Chinese people would also be incorporated into the growing empire of Japan. Most people in Europe at that point thought, well, you defeated China, no big deal. They are kind of a shadow of their former self in the late 19th century. 10 years later, however, you have a much more important war in 1904, 1905 against Russia, one of the major powers of Europe, where most of the population would be in Western Europe, but Russia would expand all the way to East Asia. If you look at, say, Vladivostok on the map, it's pretty close to Japan. And so the two countries go into a war. People assume that Russia would win because at that time European armies are dominant worldwide, and lo and behold, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Tsushima, kind of like a Pearl Harbor strategy, and won, and then fought quite bravely on land, and eventually the Russians had to sue for peace by 1905. The Japanese didn't get that much land as a result. I think they got the rights to Port Arthur, which was a Russian concession in northern China. But what they got was bragging rights, because now on the world stage, people notice, okay, Japan is a force to be reckoned with. Fast forward another 10 years, and now you're in 1914, World War I began. As such, when World War I began, it was mostly about territorial disputes within Europe over places like Bosnia or Alsace, nothing to do with the Japanese. But being an aggressively militaristic power, they really want to be part of the fun and show to powers in Europe that they were really unequal to all of their armies. So they had to pick one side to jump in, Triple Entente side of France, Britain, Russia, later the US, or the Triple Alliance side of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and the Central Powers. Well, they picked well. They flipped a coin or something. They ended up on the Triple Entente side. So that means that by the end of World War I, they were on the victorious side. If you watch the other videos I've had on World War I, remember that whether you won or lost World War I, whether you're France and Britain or Germany, the war was just disastrous to you. You lost millions of men and an immense amount of treasure as well. Well, Japan is one of the exceptions. Because they were far away from the Western Front, they didn't do that much fighting. But when the war ended, well, they asked for some rewards. And at the Versailles Treaty, when all the colonies of Germany were split, some of the territorial assets in the Pacific, like the Carolinas, like the Marianas, were given over to other colonial powers, and that included Japan. And so their prosperity sphere expanded a tiny bit more and at minimal cost. So until then, the story has been one of upward thrust for Japan, from being bullied in the 1850s to now being the mammoth power in East Asia. By the 1930s, however, they fell victim to hubris, meaning overconfidence, cockiness, in part because they were going through the Great Depression and felt the need to get resources even more. Their main target, once again, was China. In 1931, they decided that they wanted to take over Manchuria, which is the northern province of China, where the Qing emperors came from. Normally, you're not supposed to attack a country like this, so you need some kind of casus belli, or cause for war. And the Japanese, having none, manufactured one. In September of 1931, one of their railroads that they own in Mukden, Manchuria, on Chinese soil. It was a company owned by a Japanese investor. Well, one of those railroads had a track that was damaged by some explosion. The Japanese were quick to blame some terrorist attack that a Chinese nationalist must have set up the bomb to damage the Japanese railway just out of spite. And conveniently, the Japanese army was stationed in Korea, ready to invade Manchuria, and there they went under that excuse. As it turned out, this was just manufactured. The Japanese themselves had set up a bomb under their own railroad just to have an excuse to attack China. And so they took over Manchuria, turning into a puppet state, Manchukuo, led by a former emperor of China, Puyi. 1937, they came back for more, and this time they attacked all of eastern China, the whole coastal area where the bulk of the Chinese population lived. That's supposed to be a cool prosperity sphere, but the way the Japanese army treated the Chinese population has become notorious. Shanghai, when it was attacked in 1937, was filled to the brim with refugees, and the Japanese decided to go along and bomb the place from the air with modern bombers. Fortunately, the bombing of cities from the air became very common in World War II and thereafter, so people became desensitized to it. In 1937, it's still very new. You have the German bombing in Guernica in Spain, and then the Japanese bombing in Shanghai, and people still think of it as being a war crime because with the imprecise bombing you have with 1937 technology, you are going to kill civilians, and that's exactly what happened in Shanghai. The next event later that year that is even more obvious as the war crime takes place in nearby Nanjing or Nanking, and it's referred to as the rape of Nanking. A rape in the literal sense because the Japanese army comes in and then hundreds of thousands of women are molested. But rape is also in a more metaphorical sense where the Japanese army went on a wave of looting and rampage. You have people that are impaled, burned alive, chopped off, just one horrible crime after another. The Japanese officers were still wearing a sword back then as a legacy of the samurai era, and they were expected to know how to use it. So they used Chinese civilians for target practice. And one officer issued a challenge to another to say, well, I can chop off more heads than you can in a matter of a few hours. And so they have a friendly contest over the matter. And by the end of the day, one of them had chopped off, I think, something like 104 heads, and the other one had gotten all the way to 105. And so he's very proud because he had won that contest. If you're curious about that, nowadays you have some good books on the matter of the rape of Nanking, which killed an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilian lives. Understandably, the relationship between China and Japan today tend to be tense, in part because of the memories from World War II. The relationship is also tense with Korea, which was annexed as a quasi-colony of Japan at that point, due to another issue, another type of war crime, the so-called comfort women. And when you hear the expression comfort women, you think, okay, it must be a woman comfortably lounging in some armchair or something. It's not that at all. It would be more akin to sex slavery. And so the Japanese army would run some brothels. And in those brothels, you would either have prostitutes that were willing and were just paid to be there, but if you ran out of volunteers, then you would just go in the occupied areas, like, say, Korea, and pick up women against their will. And so in that case, for the duration of the war, they would become more like sex slaves. That issue is still very vivid in Korea to the present time, especially South Korea, and that's part of the legacy of dislike that you have between the former areas martyrized by Japan and Japan itself. Japan has not really come to terms with its past. Germany today is very well aware that Hitler was a horrendous figure and the Holocaust happened, and Germany today is very apologetic about it. Japan never went through that process of coming to terms with the past. You still have a big memorial in Japan that honors all the war dead, including war criminals, and the Prime Minister and the Emperor might go there every year and lay a wreath at the foot of what are war criminals. Or you'll read through the textbook that are used in Japanese school, and the way the World War II is portrayed is very disingenuous, that somehow the war began, no mention of who started it, some civilian death happened, no mention of the rape of Nanking, and the big focus after that would be on the American bombing of Japan in 1945 to show that they were victimized too. So that as a way of upsetting people like South Korea. Back in 2002, as a way to reconcile the two countries, the World Cup was organized jointly by South Korea and Japan. Both of these countries don't exactly have a very good soccer team traditionally, so it was expected it would be in pool play and then just get out of the competition early. Except South Korea, through a combination of very good luck, very good playing, and a bit of help from the refs, I must say, managed to go all the way to the semifinal, which was unprecedented for the team of South Korea. And the hope was that they might make it to the final, and the final would be played in Japan, and then you would be there in front of a Japanese audience as a South Korean team, and that would be a way to show a big middle finger to the Japanese population and avenge the memories of World War II. As it happened, they didn't make it that far, but still quite impressive. Getting to the semifinal is a really impressive achievement for a team that was really a newcomer on the world stage. But leaving soccer aside for a bit and getting back to the narrative, by 1937 you had a major Japanese invasion of China, which in essence is what began World War II in Asia. And it continued for the years after that because China was so big for Japan to conquer, they never managed to fully conquer China. So at that point, the United States started to treat Japan as a pariah that it was and tried to punish Japan for being clearly the aggressor in East Asia, and imposed an embargo on oil and scrap metal, an embargo meaning that you refuse to sell goods to that country. It's not an act of war, it's not a blockade, it's just an embargo. Japan, being so reliant on imports, especially oil and scrap metal for its armed forces, would be forced to stop operating due to that US embargo. Unless, and that's the option that they selected, they would go even further and double down and invade even more places, specifically in Southeast Asia, places like Indochina, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Sultanate of Brunei. All these places are quite rich with oil today. So they took over Indochina, that was a French colony at that time. Then they moved on to attack Malaysia and Singapore, that were British outposts, brushed aside the British army in the process, and then moved on to Indonesia, a Dutch outpost, again brushed aside the Dutch army in the process, and seemed like they were on the verge of conquering Australia as well. Nearby would be the Philippines, which was a US territory at the time, and a bit further off to the east, Hawaii, a US territory that would house a major naval base. And the Japanese figured, while we're at it, we want to take care of those threats. And so that's why on that Sunday morning of December of 1941, they attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, and also, which is often forgotten, they attacked the US Army and Air Force in the Philippines and conquered the whole of the Philippines. That's the time when, as an American nationalist, you can say, you messed with the wrong guy, mister, because that Japanese attack on American territories quickly backfired. After some initial 6 months of expanding the Pacific and reaching the maximum extent, the Japanese were forced on the defensive. They suffered some important setbacks at Midway, major naval battle with the United States, Guadalcanal against the US Marine Corps in the Solomon Islands, and then kept going back and back, losing places like Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, closer and closer to the Japanese Isles, close enough that by the spring of 1945, US B-17s, later B-29s, were able to just rain down regular bombing or fire bombs all over Japan and destroy every major city in Japan to shreds, topping it off with 2 atomic bombs in August of 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then the Russians, to top it off, attacked Manchuria. At that point, the Japanese emperor had enough and announced that he would sue for peace after all. So Japan today is kind of back from this big empire, just back to the regular archipelago of the 4 main islands plus Okinawa. So what do we have that is left from that Meiji era? Well, the empire obviously is gone. The army is also gone because Japan is no longer allowed to have a proper army. What they have is a self-defense force, just enough to defend the island in case of invasion, but not able to project their forces overseas. That's a legacy of World War II. What has remained, however, is the economic aspect, and that Japan remains per capita one of the richest countries in East Asia. Up until recently, they were the second largest economy in the world after the United States. I think China has moved ahead of them now. And if you ever ask yourself how come you have Sony Corporation and Mitsubishi and Toyota and Honda and all these famous companies, the reason is that some of them were built under the Emperor Meiji, and they're built by former samurai that have converted from wielding swords to wielding the credit card. That's what made Japan so rich, the Meiji era. See you next time.